The Haber catalyst, industrializing asphyxiation. To understand the green cloud that descended on Ypres, we must first understand the mathematical impossibility of the war that preceded it. By the winter of 1914, the Western Front had calcified into a contiguous scar stretching 475 miles from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The race to the sea was over, and the result was a strategic deadlock that defied 19th-century military doctrine. General Staff assessments from early 1915 reveal a grim calculus: the stagnation algorithm. Operational logs indicate that for every yard of ground gained in conventional trench assaults, the attacking force suffered casualty rates that made sustained offensive action statistically impossible. High explosive shells, the standard solution for dislodging entrenched infantry, were failing. The shrapnel shells used by the British 18-pounders and French 75s were designed for open warfare. Against dug-in troops protected by sandbags and earthworks, their kinetic impact was negligible. Into this stalemate stepped Fritz Haber, a Jewish-German chemist and the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry in Berlin. Haber is a figure of intense historical dichotomy. He had already altered the trajectory of human civilization with the Haber-Bosch process, a method for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. This invention, verified by patent filings from 1910, allowed for the mass production of synthetic fertilizers, literally feeding the world. But in 1915, Haber turned that same industrial capacity toward death. He approached the German High Command, the OHL, not with a tactic, but with a chemical formula. The weapon selected was chlorine. The choice was driven by logistics rather than toxicity. While more lethal agents existed in theory, chlorine was a waste product of the German dye industry, specifically the conglomerates that would later form IG Farben BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst. Industrial archives from the Rhineland confirm that Germany possessed thousands of tons of liquid chlorine sitting in storage tanks, waiting for a purpose. Scientifically, chlorine was the perfect candidate for trench warfare due to its specific gravity. With a density of approximately 3.214 kilograms per cubic meter, chlorine is roughly 2.5 times heavier than air. Haber understood the physics of the battlefield. A gas lighter than air would dissipate upward, useless against an enemy hiding below ground level. Chlorine, however, would sink. It would flow like a liquid, flooding craters, dugouts, and trenches, displacing the oxygen and forcing the enemy to the surface or condemning them to asphyxiation. However, the deployment of this weapon faced a legal hurdle: the Hague Convention of 1899. Germany was a signatory to Declaration 4.2, which explicitly prohibited the use of projectiles the sole object of which is the diffusion of asphyxiating or deleterious gases. This is where chemical engineering met legal engineering. German legal advisors, analyzing the text of the convention, argued a hyperliteral interpretation. The ban specified projectiles, defined as artillery shells or canisters fired from a gun. Haber's proposal involved no projectiles. Instead, he suggested a static release system. Thousands of commercial gas cylinders lined up along the German parapet, opened by hand, allowing the wind to carry the poison across no man's land. By using the wind as the delivery vector, the German command convinced themselves they were technically adhering to international law, a rationalization that appears repeatedly in the diplomatic correspondence of the era. Despite the scientific logic, the plan was met with skepticism by General Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff. Historical consensus, supported by Falkenhayn's own post-war memoirs, suggests he viewed the gas attack not as a war-winning strategy, but as a gruesome experiment. He assigned it to the Ypres Sector A distraction to mask the movement of troops to the Eastern Front against Russia. This skepticism is crucial to understanding the scale of what happened later. Falkenhayn refused to provide deep reserves to exploit a potential breakthrough, believing the gas would be a local nuisance rather than a front-collapsing event. Thus, the stage was set not by a grand strategic vision, but by a convergence of industrial surplus, chemical physics, and a cynical legal loophole. The weapon was not designed to win the war. It was designed to break the algorithm of the trenches. As the cylinders began to arrive at the front lines in early 1915, The soldiers handling them were told they were installing a disinfectant for the enemy trenches. The reality was far more precise. They were industrializing the act of suffocation. The cylinders of Langemark, engineering the delivery, the transition from Fritz Haber's Berlin laboratory to the trenches of the Ypres salient was not merely a shift in geography. It was a descent into a logistical nightmare. While the chemistry of the weapon had been perfected in a sterile environment, its delivery depended on the brute physical labor of soldiers knee-deep in the freezing mud of Flanders. The operation required the surreptitious installation of a massive industrial infrastructure directly under the eyes of the enemy. To achieve this, the German High Command formed a specialized unit, Pioneer Commando 36. This was no ordinary engineering corps. Regimental rosters and post-war academic biographies reveal that the unit was staffed by a bizarre hybrid of seasoned combat engineers and some of Germany's brightest scientific minds. Among those digging into the clay of the trench walls was James Franck, a quantum physicist who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1925. In the spring of 1915, however, he was not calculating electron collisions. He was supervising the installation of high-pressure gas valves, a stark testament to the total mobilization of German intellect for the war effort. The hardware itself presented a monumental challenge. The weapon system relied on standard commercial gas cylinders, repurposed for the battlefield. Logistics records from the Fourth Army indicate that two primary variants were deployed. The Type A cylinder, standing approximately 1.5 meters or 4.9 feet tall, and the smaller Type B. In total, 5,730 of these cylinders were transported to the front lines. They contained 168 tons, roughly 152 metric tons of liquid chlorine. However, the gas weight was only a fraction of the burden. The steel casings made the cylinders incredibly heavy, with a full Type A cylinder weighing over 85 kilograms, or 187 pounds. The transportation of these cylinders required a stealth operation of unprecedented scale. They could not be brought up by train or truck directly to the trench line without alerting French observation balloons. Instead, they were offloaded at rear depots and carried by hand through the communication trenches under the cover of darkness. Soldiers recall the physical agony of this task in their diaries, slipping on duckboards, struggling through suction-like mud, and stifling the metallic clanking of steel against steel to avoid drawing sniper fire. Once at the forward trench, the installation process, known as digging in, began. The cylinders could not simply be placed on the fire step. They had to be buried to protect them from shrapnel. If an Allied artillery shell were to strike an exposed bank of cylinders, the gas would release prematurely, wiping out the German trench garrison instead of the enemy. Engineers cut recesses into the parapet, the forward-facing wall of the trench, and vertically successfully embedded the cylinders in groups. Connecting the weapon to the outside world required a specific mechanism, the lead siphon. Lead was chosen for its chemical resistance to chlorine, which reacts aggressively with many other metals in the presence of moisture. These lead pipes, roughly 3 meters or 9.8 feet in length, were attached to the cylinder valves and bent upwards, snaking over the top of the trench wall. This created a significant visual signature. To hide the thousands of lead pipes prohibiting the sun from glinting off the metal, the troops employed rigorous camouflage discipline. Analyzing photographs from the period, we can see the use of moss, sandbags, and loose straw arranged to break up the outline of the pipes. The psychological strain on the German troops living with these weapons was immense. For weeks, they ate and slept alongside pressurized tanks of a substance they had been told was lethal. The danger was not theoretical. During the installation phase in late March and early April, several cylinders were breached by stray French artillery fire. Casualty reports from the XXVI Reserve Corps confirm that German soldiers were killed and injured by their own gas weeks before the attack was officially launched. These incidents forced the engineers to keep specialized moss pads soaked in a sodium thiosulfate solution and early neutralizing agent on hand at all times. By mid-April, the infrastructure of death was complete. The 5,730 cylinders were buried, the lead pipes were camouflaged, and the valves were checked. The weapon was no longer a formula on a blackboard in Berlin. It was a physical reality, a loaded gun spanning 6 kilometers, approximately 3.7 miles of the Western Front, waiting for a single variable that no engineer could control: the wind. The Meteorological Gambler. By the second week of April 1915, the German Fourth Army had transformed the northern arc of the Ypres salient into the largest chemical trap in human history. However, the trigger for this trap was not a mechanical lever or an electrical switch. It was entirely atmospheric. For the scientists of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, this was the variable they could not control: the wind. The reliance on air currents transformed the meticulously planned operation into a high-stakes meteorological gamble. The physics of the attack demanded a very specific set of conditions, creating a narrow operational window. Meteorological data and tactical manuals from the period specify the constraints. The wind had to blow from the north or north-northeast to carry the gas away from the German lines and directly into the French positions. If the wind direction shifted by even 20 degrees, the gas would drift harmlessly parallel to the lines, or, in a worst-case scenario known as blowback, wash over the German trenches. Speed was equally critical. The ideal velocity was calculated to be between 4 and 9 miles per hour, or roughly 6.4 to 14.5 kilometers per hour. If the wind was too slow, the gas would linger in no man's land, failing to reach the target before dispersing. If the wind was too fast, the turbulence would break up the cloud's density, diluting the chlorine below lethal concentrations before it could sink into the enemy dugouts. To monitor these conditions, the German commanders relied on 1915-era anemometry. There were no digital sensors. Field reports indicate the use of simple handheld anemometers, wind vanes, and the observation of smoke from small fires lit specifically for this purpose. Every morning at dawn, officers would stand on the fire step, wetting a finger or watching a flag, waiting for the vector to align. For days, the wind refused to cooperate. The attack, originally tentatively scheduled for mid-April, was scrubbed repeatedly. This delay created a dangerous paradox. The longer the cylinders sat in the trenches, the higher the probability of detection. In fact, the detection had already happened. The story of the Allied intelligence failure leading up to April 22nd is one of the most documented yet agonizing chapters of the war. We know from French military archives, specifically the interrogation transcripts of the LegacyIn Bureau, that the Allies were explicitly warned. On April 13th, 9 days before the attack, a German soldier named August Jaeger, a private in Reserve Infantry Regiment 51, deserted across the lines near Langemark. Jaeger was not vague. He provided detailed intelligence to General Ferry, the commander of the French 11th Division. Jaeger described the cylinders. He explained that they were arranged in batteries along the trench. Most damningly, he produced physical evidence: a small packet of cotton waste soaked in sodium thiosulfate. This was the primitive respirator issued to German troops to protect them from their own weapon. General Ferry believed Jaeger. He recognized the tactical implication of the batteries and the respirator. Ferry immediately issued a warning to his superiors and ordered his artillery to shell the German trench lines where Jaeger indicated the cylinders were buried. However, when the report reached General Ferdinand Foch and the British High Command, it hit a wall of cognitive dissonance. Historians debate the exact reasons for this dismissal, but correspondence between Allied commanders suggests a combination of arrogance and incredulity. The prevailing belief was that the Germans, signatories to the Hague Convention, would not resort to such barbaric methods. Others simply dismissed Jaeger as a liar, a common attitude toward deserters seeking better treatment. The intelligence was categorized as unreliable trench rumors. General Ferry was effectively silenced. Some accounts suggest he was reprimanded for alarmism. The warning was filed away, and the men of the French 45th Division Territorials and colonial troops from Algeria remained in their trenches, completely untrained in gas defense, possessing not even a rag to cover their faces. By the morning of April 22nd, the wait had become excruciating for the German troops. The cylinders had been in the ground for weeks, leaking slightly and corroding their valves. But as the sun rose that Thursday, the meteorological logs recorded a shift. The wind turned. It began to blow steadily from the north-northeast at approximately 2 meters per second, roughly 4.5 miles per hour. It was on the lower end of the viable spectrum, but it was sufficient. At 5 o'clock a.m. p.m., 5 o'clock p.m. hours German time, the order was given. The gamble had paid off. Nature had aligned with the Haber formula. The signal flares went up, and the operators laid their hands on the wrenches of 5,730 valves, preparing to release the pressure that would change the nature of warfare forever. 5 o'clock p.m. hours. The fluid dynamics of terror at precisely 5 o'clock p.m. hours on April 22nd, 1915, the sound of the Western Front changed. For months, the acoustic landscape of the Ypres salient had been defined by the staccato crack of rifles and the rhythmic thud of artillery. But at that moment, along a 6-kilometer arc stretching from Langemark to Bixschoote, a new noise emerged. Survivors' accounts preserved in the Imperial War Museum describing it not as an explosion, but as a catastrophic hissing, a sound similar to steam escaping a locomotive, but magnified thousands of times over. This was the audio signature of 5,730 valves being wrenched open simultaneously. What followed was a masterclass in aerosol physics and a tragedy of fluid dynamics. Inside the steel cylinders, the chlorine existed as a pressurized liquid. As the valves opened, the internal pressure plummeted from roughly 8 to 10 atmospheres down to ambient atmospheric pressure. This triggered an immediate phase change. The liquid chlorine boiled instantly into a gas, expanding its volume by a factor of approximately 450 to 1. This rapid expansion was governed by the Joule-Thomson effect. As the gas expanded, it consumed heat energy from its surroundings, causing its temperature to drop precipitously. This thermodynamic cooling is a critical, often overlooked detail in understanding the lethality of the attack. The gas that emerged was not just toxic, it was freezing cold. This drop in temperature increased the density of the cloud, ensuring it did not dissipate into the atmosphere. Instead, it hugged the earth. The result was a phenomenon that defied the instincts of the soldiers watching from the opposing lines. They saw two greenish-yellow columns of vapor rise from the German trenches, which then coalesced into a single, unified bank of fog. The color was distinct and horrifyingly vibrant against the spring mud. Chlorine gas absorbs light in the blue and violet spectrum, reflecting green and yellow wavelengths. Under the late afternoon sun, April 22 was a bright, sunny day. The high concentration of the gas made the cloud appear opaque and solid. Driven by the north-northeast wind, which was blowing at a gentle but steady pace of roughly 2 to 3 meters per second, about 4.5 to 6.7 miles per hour, the cloud began to drift across no man's land. It did not move like smoke, it moved like water. Because chlorine is 2.5 times denser than air, the cloud possessed significant mass. It flowed into shell craters, sank into ditches, and followed the contours of the terrain. It possessed a physical weight that allowed it to displace the air in low-lying areas. This meant that any soldier seeking cover in a depression or a foxhole, the standard survival instinct against artillery, was actually moving into a zone of maximum lethality. The dimensions of this kill zone were staggering. Aerial reconnaissance and post-battle mapping suggest the cloud front was approximately 6 kilometers, 3.7 miles, wide, and between 600 to 900 meters, 2,000 to 3,000 feet, deep. It moved relentlessly, covering the distance between the trenches in a matter of minutes. Facing this approaching wall were the troops of the French 45th Division. This division was a composite force, consisting of Zouaves, African light infantry, and Algerian tirailleurs. These were brave, combat-hardened soldiers, but they were completely scientifically unprepared for what they were seeing. According to the war diaries of the French officers present, the initial interpretation of the cloud was a tactical error rooted in conventional warfare. The officers observed the wall of smoke and concluded it was a screen designed to hide a German infantry advance. This was a standard tactic: blind the enemy with smoke, then charge with bayonets. Reacting to this perceived threat, the French commanders issued the order that sealed their fate: man the fire steps. Instead of retreating to high ground or moving perpendicular to the wind, the soldiers of the 45th Division rushed to the forward edge of their trenches. They lined the parapets, rifles at the ready, peering into the yellow mist to spot the attacking German infantry. By moving to the front of the trench, They placed themselves directly in the path of the highest concentration of the gas. The tragedy of 5 o'clock p.m. hours is that the discipline of the French troops contributed to their destruction. They stood their ground as the cloud rolled over the parapet, crashing down into the trench system like a breaking wave. Within seconds, the fluid dynamics of the gas filled the trench from the floor up. The air was pushed out, replaced entirely by a corrosive atmosphere. The confusion was absolute. Men who expected to fight bayonets were suddenly fighting for oxygen. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a biological mechanism being systematically shut down. The weapon had arrived. The Biomechanics of Total Silence, the field report from April 22nd, contains a phrase that seems contradictory to the chaos of battle: total silence. In the midst of an artillery barrage and a collapsing front line, the observer noted an absence of human noise. There were no battle cries, no orders being shouted, and, most disturbingly, very few screams. This silence was not a product of discipline/shock, it was a physiological necessity. To understand why the French 45th Division went silent, we must look at the interaction between chlorine gas and human biology at the molecular level. When the soldiers of the 45th Division took their first breath of the green mist, they were not just inhaling a toxin, they were initiating a chemical reaction inside their own bodies. Chlorine is highly soluble in water. The human respiratory system from the nose and throat down to the deepest structures of the lungs is lined with moist mucous membranes. As the gas hit these wet surfaces, it dissolved instantly. The chemistry is simple and devastating. Chlorine reacts with water to form two distinct compounds: hypochlorous acid and hydrochloric acid. Effectively, the soldiers were no longer inhaling air. They were inhaling the raw ingredients for acid. The immediate effect was a violent irritation of the upper respiratory tract. The body's autonomic nervous system reacted with a protective reflex known as a laryngospasm. The vocal cords, detecting the corrosive agent, slammed shut in a desperate attempt to seal the airway and protect the lungs. This spasm is involuntary and overpowering. It renders the victim physically incapable of speech or screaming. This is the medical explanation for the total silence reported by observers. The men were not silent because they chose to be. They were silent because their throats had mechanically locked. However, the spasm could not hold forever. The gas, dense and relentless, forced its way past the glottis and into the lower lungs, reaching the bronchial tubes and the alveoli, the tiny air sacs responsible for transferring oxygen into the bloodstream. Here, the hydrochloric acid began to dissolve the delicate tissue. This triggered the second, lethal phase of the injury, pulmonary edema. We know the specific progression of this trauma thanks to the meticulous, if gruesome, autopsy reports conducted by Allied medical officers in the days following the attack. The British Medical Journal, in an issue dated May 1915, detailed the findings. The pathologists found that the lungs were not shriveled or dry. They were heavy and waterlogged. When the acid burned the lung tissue, the body's immune system responded with massive inflammation. It flooded the damaged area with fluid plasma drawn directly from the bloodstream in an attempt to dilute and flush out the acid. But the volume of fluid was too great. The soldiers' lungs began to fill with their own plasma. The clinical term is dry land drowning. The victims were literally drowning from the inside out, struggling for air that could not penetrate the fluid-filled alveoli. This internal suffocation manifested externally in a symptom that terrified those who witnessed it: cyanosis. As the blood became starved of oxygen, it darkened. The skin of the victims transformed from a healthy pallor to a deep, slate blue, and finally to black. Medical diaries from the field hospitals describe rows of men, still conscious, sitting upright, gasping for air, their faces the color of bruised plums. The cruelty of chlorine gas was compounded by the soldiers' instinctive reaction to it. When a human being cannot breathe, the primal instinct is to run to flee the source of the suffocation. But in this specific chemical environment, the fight or flight response was a death sentence. Running requires physical exertion. It forces the heart to pump faster and the lungs to demand more oxygen. Survivors' accounts and casualty statistics reveal a grim correlation. Those who ran died fastest. By sprinting toward the rear, they increased their respiration rate. inhaling deeper drafts of the gas and accelerating the acidification of their lungs. The soldiers who fell, or those who were too terrified to move, often had a marginally higher survival rate simply because their shallow breathing reduced the dosage of the poison. By 5:15 p.m. hours, the trenches of the 45th Division were no longer a military fortification. They were an open-air chemical execution site. The men were not fighting the Germans. They were fighting their own physiology, trapped in a silent struggle against an enemy they could not shoot, struggling to breathe air that had turned into acid. The collapse of the 45th Division by 5:30 p.m. hours, 30 minutes after the valves were opened, the military cohesion of the French 45th Division had ceased to exist. In military history, we often speak of retreats or withdrawals, terms that imply a degree of command and control. What happened on the evening of April 22nd was neither. It was a total systemic disintegration, a psychological event known in 19th century military psychology as a sauve-qui-peut dash, save himself who can. The collapse began on the French front line, held by the Zouaves and the Algerian tirailleurs. As the chlorine cloud engulfed the trenches, the officers who would normally maintain discipline were among the first incapacitated. Their shouts of command turned into strangulated gasps. Without leadership and facing a threat that their rifles could not kill, the survival instinct overrode military training. The troops broke. Eyewitness accounts from the rear lines, specifically from British artillery observers stationed near the Isère Canal, describe a scene of apocalyptic confusion. They reported a chaotic mob of soldiers emerging from the yellow fog, running blindly toward the rear. These men were not carrying rifles or packs. They were tearing at their collars, their faces blackened by cyanosis, coughing up pink froth. The panic was contagious. It spread from the frontline units to the support lines of the 87th Territorial Division, older reservists who saw the colonial troops fleeing and the Green Wall approaching, and joined the rout. The scale of this displacement was massive. Operational maps from the French Army archives confirm that within 1 hour, the entire defensive frontage of the 45th Division, roughly 6,000 meters or 3.7 miles of trench line, had been abandoned. The retreat did not stop at the reserve lines. It poured back nearly 4 miles to the bridges of the canal. The roads leading to Vlamertinghe became clogged with a mixture of blinding soldiers, terrified horses, and retreating artillery caissons, all struggling to escape the smell of bleach that was drifting on the wind. The result was a phenomenon that had not been seen since the race to the sea ended in 1914, a gap in the Western Front. By 6 o'clock p.m. hours, a hole approximately 8,000 yards, roughly 7.3 kilometers wide, had opened up in the Allied line. To put this in perspective, this was not just a breach, it was an open door to the Channel ports. There were no troops, no guns, and no defenses standing between the German army and the city of Ypres. The road was wide open. This leads to one of the most debated questions of the First World War. Why didn't the Germans march through? From the perspective of the Allied commanders, the failure of the Germans to exploit this gap was a miracle. However, an analysis of German operational records from the Fourth Army reveals a different story, grounded in the logistical skepticism we discussed in Chapter 1. General Erich von Falkenhayn had never intended this attack to be a breakthrough operation. He viewed the gas as an experiment, a force multiplier to test its viability. Consequently, he had refused to assign deep strategic reserves to the sector. The German infantry units present, elements of the XEI and XXVI Reserve Corps, were sufficient to take the first line of trenches, but they lacked the manpower to execute a deep penetration into the Allied rear. Furthermore, the German advance was slowed by a factor their own scientists had predicted, but the infantry had not fully internalized: fear of their own weapon. The German soldiers following the cloud were advancing into the same toxic residue that had just destroyed the French. They were wearing primitive protective gear, simple cotton pads soaked in thiosulfate tied around their mouths. These offered minimal protection against high concentrations of chlorine. Regimental diaries from the German 51st and 52nd Reserve Divisions described the infantry moving cautiously, terrified of running into the gas. They stopped frequently to test the air. When they reached the abandoned French artillery positions, instead of pushing forward into the open gap, they dug in. They consolidated their gains on the Pilcum Ridge, obeying the rigid timetables of a limited offensive rather than seizing the fluid opportunity of a rout. The sun set on April 22nd with a surreal strategic picture. The Allies had lost a division, 50 field guns, and the integrity of their line. The Germans had walked forward almost unopposed for 2 miles, capturing high ground that had been impregnable for months. Yet, the decisive stroke was missing. The German High Command, surprised by the magnitude of their own success, had no plan to follow it up. They had broken the deadlock, but they had not brought the army to finish the job. As night fell, the gas dispersed, leaving the Canadian 1st Division on the right flank of the breach staring into the void, realizing that they were now the only thing standing between the German army and total disaster. The Canadian flank and the Urea solution. As the sun set on April 22nd, the Allied line in the Ypres salient had been severed. The collapse of the French 45th Division created a void 8,000 yards wide, a gateway through which the German army could ostensibly march to the sea. Standing on the immediate right flank of this catastrophe was the 1st Canadian Division. Unlike the reservists and territorials who had just fled, these were fresh troops, volunteers who had yet to see a major battle. They were now holding an exposed apex, their left flank hanging in the air, with the residue of the gas cloud drifting laterally into their positions in the chaos of the retreat. One man's scientific background proved as vital as an artillery battery. Lieutenant Colonel George Naismith was not a combat infantry officer. He was a hydrologist and a sanitation expert serving as an advisor to the Canadian command. While others saw a demonic fog, Naismith smelled a chemical signature. In his report to General Edwin Alderson, preserved in the Canadian National Archives, Naismith identified the distinct odor of bleaching powder. He correctly deduced that the Germans were using chlorine gas. This identification was the difference between panic and survival. Naismith understood that chlorine was water-soluble. This meant it could be neutralized, or at least dampened, by a solvent. Water was the obvious choice, but in the trenches, clean water was scarce, often stored in petrol tins at the rear. However, Naismith and the medical officers realized there was a readily available source of ammonia-rich fluid that every soldier carried with him: urine. The order that passed down the Canadian line is one of the most surreal commands in military history. Medical officers and NCOs moved through the trenches instructing soldiers to urinate on their handkerchiefs, socks, or pieces of cotton bandoliers, and tie them over their noses and mouths. This was not folklore. It was improvised battlefield chemistry. Urine contains urea and small amounts of ammonia. When chlorine gas comes into contact with urea, a chemical reaction occurs. The chlorine oxidizes the urea, breaking it down. While the reaction is complex, the basic principle was that the wet fabric acted as a filter, dissolving the chlorine gas into a liquid state before it could enter the lungs, while the urea reacted with the chlorine to form chloramines. While chloramines are still irritants that cause eye and throat pain, they lack the acute lethality of pure chlorine gas. This crude biochemical shield did not stop the pain, nor did it prevent long-term injury, but it prevented the immediate asphyxiation that had destroyed the French 45th. Armed with this desperate protection, the Canadians did not just hold, they counterattacked. The German advance had halted near a dense oak plantation known as Kitchener's Wood, unrelated to Lord Kitchener, but a translation of the French Bois de Cuisiniers. The Germans were digging in, setting up machine gun nests to secure their new flank. The Allied command realized that if the Germans solidified this position, the entire salient would fall. Shortly before midnight, the 10th Battalion, from Alberta and Manitoba, and the 16th Battalion, the Canadian Scottish, were ordered to retake the wood. The operation was a tactical suicide mission. They had to advance 500 yards, roughly 457 meters across open ground, under moonlight, against an entrenched enemy. Without artillery support, the assault began at 11:46 p.m. hours. War diaries from the 10th Battalion record that the soldiers advanced in silence until they hit the German wire. The ensuing combat was medieval in its brutality. Rifle butts, bayonets, and improvised clubs were used to clear the trenches inside the wood. The Canadians succeeded in driving the Germans back and capturing the planned objective, closing the gap temporarily. However, the The cost of this improvisation was staggering. The roll call documents following the battle reveal the price of holding the flank. The 10th Battalion went into the attack with 816 men. By the next morning, only 193 were present for duty. They had suffered a casualty rate of over 76% in a single night. The defense of the Ypres salient by the Canadians prevented a total Allied collapse. They held the line for 2 more days of gas attacks, breathing through urine-soaked rags, buying time for British and French reserves to plug the gap. Their stand proved that the psychological terror of the weapon could be overcome with discipline and crude science. But the medical reality was unavoidable. By April 24th, the Canadian hospitals were overwhelmed with men coughing up the lining of their lungs. The gas had not broken the line, but it had permanently altered the physiology of the men who held it. Pandora's Isotope, the Aftermath and LegacyIn. In the days following the collapse of the French 45th Division, the Allied High Command did not just count the dead, they dissected them. The first true understanding of what had happened on April 22nd came not from the battlefield, but from the morgue. Field Marshal Sir John French's official dispatch, dated June 15th, 1915, relies heavily on the forensic pathology reports conducted by the Royal Army Medical Corps. These autopsies revealed a terrifying biological reality. The weapon had not targeted the soldiers' external bodies, but their internal chemistry. Pathologists noted that the victims' lungs weighed up to 4 times their normal mass. When sliced open, they did not look like respiratory organs. They resembled sponges soaked in blue fluid. The cause of death was officially listed as asphyxia, but the medical notes describe a far more violent process: the complete dissolution of the bronchial lining. This was the moment the gentleman's war officially ended. The autopsy tables proved that the objective was no longer to incapacitate the enemy, but to liquidate them from the inside out. The Allied response to this atrocity was not a demand for cessation, but an immediate, frantic escalation. The German success at Ypres triggered the most rapid chemical arms race in human history. Within weeks, British and French laboratories were mobilizing to replicate and exceed the German arsenal. By the autumn of 1915, the crude chlorine clouds were already considered obsolete. They were replaced by phosgene. This new agent was a synthesis of carbon monoxide and chlorine, verified by chemists to be roughly 18 times more lethal than the gas used on April 22nd. Unlike chlorine, phosgene was colorless and had a deceptively pleasant odor, often described in survivor accounts as smelling like moldy hay. It did not cause the immediate coughing fit that chlorine did, meaning soldiers would continue to inhale it until a lethal dose had accumulated in their bloodstream, often dying 48 hours later. The defense technology evolved in lockstep. The urine-soaked rags of the Canadians were quickly replaced by the black veil respirator and subsequently the P helmet, or tube helmet. These were flannel hoods impregnated with sodium phenolate, a chemical designed to neutralize phosgene. The war had transformed into a contest between the industrial chemist synthesizing the poison and the textile engineer designing the filter. Yet, for all the horror and the scientific mobilization, the strategic result of the Second Battle of Ypres was negligible. The German Fourth Army, despite unleashing a weapon that broke the laws of war and physics, failed to take the city. When the battle officially concluded on May 25, 1915, the lines had moved roughly 3 miles closer to Ypres. The salient was smaller, but it was still held by the British. The stagnation algorithm, discussed in Chapter 1, remained unsolved. The gas had killed thousands, but it had not broken the stalemate. It merely made the stalemate more expensive, more toxic, and more terrifying. The legacy of April 22, 1915, is not found in the shifting of borders, but in the soil itself. Today, the fields around Langemark and Polkapelle appear peaceful, covered in crops and monuments. But environmental archaeology tells a different story. Analysis of the subsoil in the Ypres salient reveals a persistent chemical fingerprint. Heavy metals, including arsenic and lead components of the detonators and shells used to deliver later gas variants, remain in the ground at concentrations far exceeding European Union safety standards. Furthermore, the iron harvest continues to this day. Every year, Belgian farmers unearth tons of unexploded ordnance during the plowing season. A significant percentage of these are toxic shells. The Belgian Bomb Disposal Unit, DOVO, Dienst voor Opruiming en Vernietiging van Ontploffingsstukken, maintains a specialized facility at Polkapel to dismantle these century-old chemical weapons. They are still lethal. A shell fired in 1915, buried in the anaerobic clay of Flanders, retains its liquid chlorine or phosgene payload intact. The weapon Fritz Haber designed to break the trenches is still waiting in the dark, 100 years later, ready to kill the moment it is exposed to the air. April 22nd did not just change the tactics of World War I. It crossed a moral event horizon. It was the day science was fully conscripted into the business of mass slaughter. Before Ypres, the air we breathe was considered neutral ground. After Ypres, the atmosphere itself became a potential weapon. The green cloud that rolled over the French trenches was the precursor to every hazmat suit, every nerve agent, and every fear of biological terror that defines the modern age. The silence of the 45th Division was the first quiet signal of the century of total war.